You know something curious happens when you begin to wake up from the collective dream of human existence. You find yourself rather uncomfortable around the very people you once called friends. They talk about promotions. You hear desperation for external validation. They complain about rivals. You see ego defending its territory. They plan futures. You recognize anxiety about the present. They gossip. You observe fear of irrelevance. They share achievements. You detect the screaming emptiness those achievements were meant to fill, and the exhaustion. The exhaustion of it, not because you're judging them. Quite the opposite. You see them with almost unbearable clarity and compassion. You see the suffering driving every word, every gesture, every claim of happiness. You see the prison they're living in while calling it freedom. And you cannot save them, cannot wake them, cannot even explain what you see without sounding mad or arrogant. So you smile, nod, and feel your energy drain away like water from a cracked vessel. They give you some examples of how this plays out, so you'll recognize what I'm describing in your own life. First scenario. Your friend visits, excited about their new luxury car. They show you photos, describe the leather interior, mention the price, and the neighbor's reaction. But you don't see a car. You see a 48-month payment plan binding them to a job they hate. You see status anxiety. You see the belief that identity can be purchased. You see the next craving already forming before this one is satisfied. And you're expected to share their enthusiasm for their own change. Second scenario. Someone complains about their terrible boss, their backstabbing colleague, their unfair workload. They want validation, commiseration, agreement that they're the victim of circumstance. But you see something else entirely. You see someone who's made themselves dependent on external approval for survival. You see resistance to what is, which creates all suffering. You see the ego's endless need to be right, to be wrong, to have an enemy. You see a mind trapped in its own narrative, and you cannot offer the validation they seek without reinforcing their prison. Third scenario. A family member asks when you'll get a real job, settle down, buy property, have children, follow the script, in other words. They're genuinely concerned because from within the hypnosis you look lost. But you're not lost. You're simply not following a map to destinations you don't want to reach. You see, they're not really worried about your happiness. They're worried about the discomfort your different path creates for their certainty. Your very existence asks questions they'd rather not contemplate. Fourth scenario. Old friends gather, reminiscing about shared memories, shared struggles, shared beliefs you've all grown from. Except you're the only one who's actually grown. They're still telling the same stories, nursing the same wounds, believing the same limitations. The nostalgia they feel is comforting to them. But to you, it's like being asked to wear clothes you've outgrown. You've become a different size, a different shape. The past doesn't fit anymore. Fifth scenario, someone shares their anxiety about world events, political divisions, economic uncertainty, climate catastrophe. They want you to share their fear, to confirm that yes, everything is terrible and getting worse. But you can't offer that confirmation because you've seen through the illusion of separateness that makes such fear possible. You've realized that the universe isn't happening to you. You're happening as the universe. The wave cannot be threatened. And trying to explain this sounds callous to someone drowning in the illusion of being a separate self under threat. In each case, you see deeper, not because you're superior, but because you've died to the illusions that still animate them. And that death, that seeing, makes ordinary interaction feel like a performance you no longer have the energy to give. You see, here's what's really happened to you. You've lost your taste for pretense. It's not that you've become more honest in some moral sense. It's that you've become allergic to falsehood. The artificial flavors that once seemed palatable now trigger your gag reflex. Think of it like this. Authenticity isn't a virtue you've cultivated. It's simply what remains when you can no longer maintain the exhausting machinery of social performance. You stopped fake laughing at jokes you don't find funny. You stopped nodding along with opinions you don't share. You stopped asking, how are you? When you know the answer will be a reflexive lie and you're not prepared to hear the truth anyway, this makes you terrible at small talk, dreadful at networking, hopeless at the sort of shallow pleasantries that lubricate social interactions. Not because you're rude or antisocial, but because you've become like a tuning fork that resonates only with genuine frequency. Everything else just sounds wrong now. When visitors come, they expect you to play the game. The game of pretending everything's fine. The game of caring about things you don't care about. The game of maintaining the comfortable fictions that make civilized society possible. But you can't. The mechanism that once allowed such pretense has broken down completely. And here's the peculiar bit. This isn't a choice you're making. You couldn't go back to pretending even if you wanted to. It would be like asking an adult to genuinely believe in Father Christmas again. Once certain illusions dissolve, they don't reconstitute themselves simply because maintaining them would be socially. So you find yourself craving solitude, not because you dislike people, but because solitude doesn't require performance. The trees don't expect you to pretend. The silence doesn't need you to fill it with noise. The sky doesn't measure you against arbitrary standards. In nature, in stillness, in aloneness, you can simply be without the exhausting work of maintaining a false self to meet others' expectations. The spiritually awake don't dislike visitors, they dislike what visitors require them to become. There's another dimension to this discomfort that's worth examining. Most people are running frantically toward goals that, from your perspective, are rather like chasing mirages in a desert. They believe the oasis is real. They're convinced that reaching it will finally quench their thirst. And they cannot understand why you're not running alongside them. They're pursuing promotions, but you see the futility of climbing a ladder leaning against the wrong wall. They're accumulating possessions, but you recognize that no amount of stuff fills existential emptiness. They're seeking approval, but you realize that external validation is an unwinnable game with ever-shifting goalposts. They're planning retirement, but you understand that postponing life until later guarantees you'll miss it. What does one talk about when your entire framework of meaning has shifted? When their treasure is your trash? When their dreams are your nightmares? When their success looks like your failure? You see, the awakened person hasn't necessarily achieved some grand alternative purpose. Often they've simply stopped believing that life requires justification through achievement. They've dropped out of the race not because they're lazy, but because they've seen through the arbitrary nature of the finish line. The rat race, as they say, remains a race even if you win. And you're still a rat. This creates an unbridgeable gap in conversation. They ask what you're working toward, and your honest answer: nothing really. Sounds like depression to ears trained in the religion of progress. They share their 5-year plan, and your lack of one seems like aimlessness rather than presence. They celebrate their milestones, and you're in judgment even when it's simply that. How do you explain to someone still enchanted by the dream that you've woken up? How do you convey that doing nothing can be more profound than doing everything? How do you share that you've found the treasure they're seeking, and it was never in any of the places they're looking? You don't usually. You let them talk about their pursuits and plans and purposes, and you feel the enormous gulf between you widen with every word. Not because you've moved away from them, but because you've stopped moving in circles. Now we come to the heart of the matter, the thing that truly sets you apart and makes ordinary interaction feel like speaking across dimensions. You've died, not physically, obviously, but psychologically. The person you thought you were has dissolved, and what remains doesn't fit comfortably into social structures designed for egos. This is rather difficult to explain to someone who hasn't experienced it. It's like trying to describe color to someone born blind. The vocabulary simply doesn't translate. But here's an attempt. The voice in your head that used to narrate your life, defend your positions, worry about your image, plan your future. That voice has either gone silent or revealed itself to be an impersonal process you're watching rather than being. The self you once protected so fiercely turns out to have been a story, no more real than a character in a novel. And once that story is seen through, once the protagonist of your life is revealed as fictional, what's left? Consciousness itself, awareness without an owner. Life happening without anyone living it. This is what the mystics point to with all their peculiar language. This is aloneness, not loneliness, mind you, but all oneness. The absence of the separate self that was always an illusion anyway. You see, loneliness requires a lonely person. It requires belief in the separate self who can be isolated from others. But when that self dissolves, so does the possibility of loneliness. What visitors bring into your space is the constant invitation to resurrect the ego, to have opinions, to take sides, to defend positions, to maintain a consistent personality, to be someone. But you've seen through the someone. You've discovered that beneath all the acquired personality, there's no one home. And paradoxically, that's when you're finally fully present. Aloneness, then, is an isolation. It's the recognition that separation was always the illusion, the wave discovering its ocean, the drop realizing its water, the person awakening to the fact that their consciousness wearing a human costume, not a human occasionally having conscious experiences. And when you dwell in that recognition, even partially, even occasionally, the presence of others who are still convinced they're separate selves becomes incredibly jarring, like static disrupting a clear signal, like noise interrupting silence, so you retreat into solitude. Not as an escape, but as a foundation, not as the opposite. It's not running away from the world, it's going deep enough to touch the source that makes meaningful engagement with the world possible. In silence, you remember what the noise made you forget. In stillness, you reconnect with the current beneath all movement. In aloneness, you dissolve the illusion of separateness that makes genuine meeting impossible. You're not avoiding others. You're preparing to actually see them rather than simply projecting your needs and narratives on them. The spiritually awake person needs solitude, the way a musician needs to tune their instrument. You cannot play in harmony with others when your strings are adjusted to their dissonance simply to fit in. You must first find your true pitch, your authentic frequency. And that requires time away from the cacophony. This is why visitors feel like interruptions. Not interruptions of your plans or your comfort, but interruptions of your being. Each interaction that requires you to abandon your center to meet others in their unconsciousness. To pretend the emperor's clothes. It's not just exhaustion. It's a small betrayal of the truth you've worked so hard to remember. So you protect your solitude fiercely. Not because you're antisocial, but because you've discovered that the quality of your presence in the world depends entirely on the depth of your absence. But here's the final twist, my friends, the cosmic joke hidden in all of this. The you who wants to be alone, who finds visitors exhausting, who craves solitude, that you is also an illusion. A more subtle one, perhaps, but an illusion nonetheless. Because what are you really? You're the universe experiencing itself from a particular vantage point. You're not in the universe. The universe is happening as you. Every person who visits, every interaction you find exhausting, every voice that disrupts your peace, that's also you. The wave cannot separate itself from the ocean, even when it pretends to prefer isolation. The truly awake don't reject visitors because they've transcended the need for connection. They simply stop forcing connections that aren't organic. They allow life to bring what it brings and take what it takes without resistance. They become like water, assuming whatever form the container requires, but never betraying their essential nature. So perhaps the question isn't why the spiritually awake don't like visitors. Perhaps the real question is, why do we believe we need to like or dislike anything at all? What if you're simply the space in which all experience happens? What if the discomfort you feel around others is just another wave in the ocean of consciousness you are? What if you've been alone all along, gloriously, unavoidably, cosmically alone, and also never alone for even a moment? Now, my friends, sit with that.